Have you ever noticed how a conversation can follow you long after it ends? You might be lying in bed at night, scrolling through your phone, or just sitting quietly when suddenly your mind brings something back. Not the whole conversation, just one small moment. A sentence you said, a pause in someone's response, the way someone looked at you for half a second longer than usual. And before you realize it, the scene starts replaying in your mind like a short clip on repeat. You hear the words again. You imagine how the other person might have interpreted them. You wonder if you explained yourself clearly. And then another thought appears. Maybe that sounded strange. Maybe they took it the wrong way. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. The conversation is already over. Nothing about it can change anymore. But your mind keeps going back to it as if it's still unfolding. For some people, this happens occasionally. But for others, it's a pattern. After social interactions, their brain quietly returns to the details. Not because they want to overthink, but because their mind feels like it still needs to understand what happened. Why did they pause before responding? Why did the energy shift for a second? Did they seem slightly different after that comment? And the interesting thing is, most people around them probably never noticed anything unusual at all, but their brain did. And once the brain notices something, it doesn't always let it go easily, because human beings are wired to care deeply about social interactions. Long before modern life, our survival depended heavily on belonging to a group. Being accepted meant safety. Being rejected meant something much more dangerous. So over time, our brains developed systems that pay close attention to social signals, facial expressions, tone of voice, subtle shifts in someone's mood. These signals help us understand whether a connection is safe or uncertain. Most people notice these things briefly and move on, but some people notice them more intensely. Their brain is naturally tuned in to emotional detail. They pick up on pauses that others overlook. They hear small changes in tone. They notice when someone's energy shifts, even slightly. And this ability can actually be a form of social intelligence. It means their brain is good at reading emotional information, but it also means their brain stores that information more carefully.
So when the conversation ends, the mind doesn't always move on right away. Instead, it reopens the moment later, reviewing it, replaying it, trying to understand it more clearly. Sometimes this happens hours later, sometimes days later, and occasionally even years later. You might suddenly remember something you said in a conversation from long ago and think, why did I say it like that? It's a strange experience because in the moment, the interaction didn't seem important enough to stay in your mind, but somehow it did. And psychology suggests that this pattern usually starts earlier in life than most people realize. When someone grows up in an environment where emotional responses feel very clear and consistent, the brain learns something simple. Connection is predictable. But when emotional responses feel confusing or inconsistent, the brain learns something different. It learns to pay attention, very close attention. Maybe someone was warm and supportive most of the time, but sometimes distant for reasons that weren't clear. Maybe affection appeared and disappeared without explanation. Maybe reactions changed quickly depending on mood or stress. When that happens, the brain begins trying to understand people more carefully. Children are especially sensitive to these emotional signals. They don't analyze relationships logically, they experience them emotionally. So when something feels uncertain, the brain starts quietly observing. It begins watching for patterns, and over time, that habit can turn into a kind of emotional awareness. The mind becomes very good at detecting subtle shifts in people's behavior. It becomes skilled at reading between the lines in conversations. But with that awareness comes another habit, revisiting interactions later to make sure they were understood correctly. Because when emotional signals feel important, the brain doesn't want to miss them, so it replays the moment. Did I misunderstand what they meant? Did they misunderstand what I meant? Was there something I didn't notice at the time? At first, this kind of thinking feels like curiosity, but if it happens often enough, it can start feeling like overthinking. And this is usually the point where people become frustrated with themselves. They tell themselves things like, why can't I just let it go? Why do I keep thinking about this? Why am I like this? But here's something interesting. People who replay conversations in their heads are often the same people who notice emotional details that others miss. They notice when someone is pretending to be okay. They notice when someone's mood shifts even if the person says nothing. They remember small things people mention in passing. And this ability to notice subtle emotional signals can actually make someone very empathetic.
They understand people's feelings more easily. They can sense tension in a room before anyone talks about it. They can read emotional dynamics in conversations that seem ordinary to others. But here's where the pattern becomes complicated. Because when someone notices emotional nuance very clearly, they can also become more sensitive to ambiguity. If someone responds a little slower than usual, their brain notices. If someone's tone feels slightly different, their brain notices. And when the mind notices something but doesn't fully understand it, it tends to return to it later, trying to figure it out. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Replaying conversations isn't always about embarrassment. Sometimes it's about control. When social interactions feel uncertain, the brain tries to reduce that uncertainty by analyzing the moment. If it can understand what happened, maybe the next interaction will be easier. So the mind begins simulating possibilities. Maybe they were distracted. Maybe they misunderstood what I meant. Maybe I should have explained it differently. Each possibility becomes a way of organizing the memory. The brain is essentially trying to make sense of something that felt slightly unclear. But human communication is rarely precise. People respond based on their mood, their stress levels, their own internal thoughts, which means the meaning of an interaction isn't always easy to decode. And when the mind searches for answers in something ambiguous, it often creates multiple interpretations, some of them reassuring, some of them critical. And the more the brain revisits the moment, the more significant that moment can start to feel. A small pause might begin to feel meaningful. A neutral expression might start to seem negative. Not because the moment was actually negative, but because the brain is trying to fill in missing information. And this is why people sometimes replay conversations that happened years ago. A small, awkward moment suddenly returns to their mind, not because the moment was life-changing, but because the brain never fully categorized it as understood, so it occasionally revisits it, almost like a file that was never completely closed. But here's the deeper layer that people rarely talk about. Replaying conversations isn't always a sign of insecurity. It's often a sign of reflection. Some people naturally process experiences internally. They think through situations slowly. They analyze interactions after they happened. They prefer understanding something deeply before moving on. This reflective style of thinking can actually lead to stronger emotional insight. It helps people understand how conversations unfold, how different personalities communicate, how emotional signals move between people. But reflection can sometimes drift into something heavier, rumination. Reflection asks questions with curiosity. Rumination asks questions with self-criticism. Reflection sounds like, "What happened there?" Rumination sounds like, "Why did I mess that up?" Both involve replaying a moment, but they feel very different internally. And people who replay conversations often move between those two states without realizing it. Sometimes they're simply processing the interaction. Other times they're searching for mistakes. But the underlying reason is usually the same. Their brain cares deeply about understanding social connection. And connection is one of the most complex parts of human life, because every person communicates differently. Every person interprets words through their own experiences, which means no conversation ever has just one meaning. And once you start seeing communication this way, something becomes clear. Replaying conversations isn't just a random mental habit. It's the mind trying to understand people, trying to understand relationships, trying to understand connection. And once you begin noticing that pattern, the experience starts to feel different, because the question slowly shifts. Instead of asking, why do I keep replaying conversations, you start noticing something else, how deeply your mind is trying to understand the emotional world around it. And once you see that pattern clearly, you can't really unsee it, because the replay was never just about overthinking. It was your mind paying attention to connection. And understanding connection has always been one of the most human things we do.